Here at the Global Fintech Fest, where we have our theme partner, WhatsApp, co-powered by Amazon Pay. Spend management partner, we have Encash in association with Perfios. Payments partner, Cash-Free Payments, and CEO's dinner partner, HSBC. Well, up next, ladies and gentlemen, we again are moving ahead with yet another panel discussion. And the topic that will be discussed is deliberating fintech, delivering faster, cheaper, and secure real-time payments across the globe. And to moderate this panel discussion, may I please request Mr. Anubhav Sharma, Deputy Chief Partnership Business Development and Marketing, NPCI International Payments Limited, NIPL, to kindly step up on stage. Please help me welcome him with a huge round of applause. Yay, yes. And also, amongst our panelists, we would request Ms. Barbara Dreyer, Director, National Payment System, Bank of Namibia, to join us with our esteemed panelists. We'd also request Ms. Deeksha Kaushal, Director, Financial Services and Banking Partnerships, Google Pay, who's joined us today. And we request Mr. Jorge Zaccaro, co-founder Minka INK, to step up on stage, alongside Mr. Shergeran Naidoo, Head Stakeholder Engagements, BankservAfrica. Looking forward to yet another insightful session coming up right next. And may I please request Mr. Moderator, Anubhav Sharma, to take it over from here.
Thank you. I think we'll still wait for some people to come in. But, we were just having a pre-discussion and we had an interesting discussion. We were beginning to figure out the traffic, because three of the panelists here are from overseas. And we had an interesting discussion on how the traffic here in India is different and how the payments are going to be different. Taking that cue, before we begin, may I request Barbara to introduce herself and then going to the left before we begin. Barbara.
Thank you, Anubhav. My name is Barbara Dreyer. I am the director responsible for the national payment system at the Central Bank of Namibia, which is basically the equivalent of the Reserve Bank of India here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Deeksha Kaushal. I look after banking and financial services partnerships for Google Pay in India.
Hi, I'm Jorge Zaccaro from Minka. I'm a software engineer and economist, and Minka is building real-time payments infrastructure for Latin America.
Hi, I'm Shergeran, Head of Stakeholder Engagements at BankservAfrica. BankservAfrica is in South Africa, and we're essentially the equivalent of NPCI. I say that tongue-in-cheek because we know that we're obviously aspiring to emulate them. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. And just to take it forward, a couple of statements from my side on why this topic is important today. The world today is moving to cross-border payments in a big and effective way. There are real-time payment systems which are growing across the world. And it's only prudent that we now look at extending it to cross-border on a real-time payment mechanism. And the reason we are now looking at deliberating on this specific topic with the panelists here is to see how the regulators, the most loved technology companies, the networks, and also the technology rail providers can come together to provide for an efficient cross-border real-time payment systems. And with that as a background, Barbara, if I can start with you, one of the most important things that's shaping up in the G20 countries, it's become a priority to look at the cross-border payment systems. So given that the G20 has a focus on enabling real-time, low-cost cross-border payment systems, kindly help enlighten us with a regulatory perspective on how do you see it in terms of the assessments, the challenges, and the way forward.
Thank you, Anubhav. I think when it comes to payment systems, and especially cross-border payment systems, everybody would potentially agree with me that it is very complex. It's complex in the sense that we have an ecosystem that has various stakeholders involved. There are different time zones, a variety of participants and jurisdictions, each one with their own regulations. Now, to bring all of these together for efficient and effective cross-border payments, it's definitely no walk in the park. So that in itself basically leads to, especially when we look at cross-border payments, to a lot of high costs that is involved. We have low speed. These transactions take long to be effected. There's also limited access as well as limited transparency. Now, how do we ensure that we can overcome these hurdles and frictions that are involved in these type of things? So taking it from a G20 perspective, they have really come up with a very good document that speaks to roadblocks after identifying some of these challenges that we all can relate to. And these building blocks speak to issues around how best can we, both public sector and private sector, get together and rally behind a common vision and targets based on our own jurisdictional realities, based on our own regional realities, because there is going to be no one-size-fits-all. So we have to get together to work through those intricacies in terms of ensuring we can come up with something. Then, of course, regulatory alignment is something that is very important. And in this regard, if I can just look at it from a Southern African perspective, of course, we are also looking at harmonizing. How best can we harmonize our regulations? In Southern Africa, there has been quite a lot of work to work through some model laws in terms of trying to work towards that harmonization. We cannot just throw out another building block is looking at the existing payment infrastructures and arrangements. Obviously, you cannot just throw it away and then make space for the new things. You need to see what can be done with the current arrangements. So that is also a building block emanating from the G20, the data and infrastructure, as well as what are some of the new payment infrastructures. So whilst these building blocks, each one have their own pathways, if you address some of them, others, they are also quite interdependent. So from those building blocks, it is now incumbent upon different stakeholders to take it from there and to make it their own. And then from a regulatory perspective, of course, this is something that is high on our agenda also, to ensure efficient, near real-time or real-time and faster cross-border payments where the cost is significantly reduced. Those of you who are familiar with the Southern Africa corridor, you will know that remittances from World Bank studies, you will know that remittances are one of the most expensive to our corridor. So there is definitely a huge objective for especially the central banks to look into that and to ensure that the cost, we can bring down the cost of cross-border payments to our jurisdictions. So that is really the context and what we are working towards in terms of ensuring how best we can address some of these challenges. Thank you, Anubhav.
Absolutely. Yeah. Barbara, I think you bring about some very important points, the harmonization of the payments, and I think it all goes back to having some efficient railroads on payments within the country before you can kind of logically extend it. And I think then I can jump on to Mr. Naidoo. You represent BankservAfrica. It's been around for 50 years. You've been operating within the SADC region. I mean, it would be opportune for me to ask you, because you run the platform there and you are soon to go live with the real-time payment platform within the South Africa region. If you could give a brief on how your experience has been as you go live, maybe we can build from there. Shergeran.
Thank you, Anubhav. So BankservAfrica, as Anubhav's indicated, has been around for 50 years. We're the payment clearinghouse system operator that services the national payment system domestically. We are also the regional clearing settlement operator for the SADC region in terms of a payment stream they called TCIB, which is newly established. I'm going to focus for this portion of the question, just listening to Anubhav's question around the Rapid Payments Program, which is a domestic real-time payments initiative that we've been working with the industry to establishing. That being said, though, South Africa has actually had real-time payments, which predates this initiative. It goes as far back as 2006, 2007. We instituted a real-time payment system called RTC. RTC was one of the world's first real-time payment systems. However, the uptake for RTC was unfortunately not as well as it was inadequate. Let's just call a spade a spade. The pricing wasn't great. There were branding issues in the sense that different banks branded their own real-time payments offering according to their own marketing campaigns. Fraud and risk management concerns because of the fact that it was real-time, all of which culminated in the increased pricing. And there was a realization by the regulator and the industry that we needed to modernize the national payment system, modernize our credit push payment streams, and that's where the RPP initiative was launched. It actually emanated out of a visit to, firstly there was a global research that was undertaken in 2017 between BankservAfrica and the Payments Association of South Africa. There were 11 countries that were explored, and as part of that, it was really about 11 different countries globally that were engaged in some way or form around modernization of their payment systems. India, of course, was right at the top of that list, and the outcome of that resulted in a research paper in which it indicated that modernization was not just restricted to implementation of ISO 20022 standards, that there were a whole myriad of other factors that also had to be incorporated, a whole myriad of other scopes and considerations that also need to be taken into consideration, and which then led to it dovetailed into the Vision 2025, which was the South African Reserve Bank's vision for the modernization of the national payment system. And as part of that whole process, the industry then galvanized and worked together towards this. We undertook a global study tour in 2019. It was coordinated between BankservAfrica, the Payments Association of South Africa, as well as PwC, in which there were role players across the ecosystem from banks, fintechs, regulators, and the study tour came through to Southeast Asia. It came through to India, Singapore, Thailand, and China. And the outcomes of that study tour resulted in the actual work that went into the development of the RPP program, which really, once again, it was a multi-stakeholder driven program, which had myriad of different factors in terms of the design of the process, came up with a South African case for change for developing of this real-time payment system. And ultimately, we then appointed a technology service provider. We appointed TCS, also from India. So as you can see, India plays a big role in the serving as a blueprint for what we've been trying to accomplish in South Africa. We currently in the stage where now we've signed up banks. The banks have been going through all of the testing and working towards market acceptance testing. We will be going live in March of next year. The brand's name is going to be launched into the market as PayShop. Shop is a vernacular colloquialism in South Africa, which means everything is shop. And so that's the way that it's going to be marketed. And we're really anticipating that this is going to have a meaningful impact in South Africa towards displacement of cash. Anubhav, I don't know if that I've tried to sum it up.
No, it does. Shergeran, I think one important point that I picked up is modernization. You're looking at bottoms-up approach, creating that entire technology stack. And maybe, that brings me to Jorge. He is the co-founder from Minka. They run the private ACH in Colombia. Jorge, now we're talking about, building the technology stack again for an efficient domestic payments and then logically extending to cross-border, because we believe that efficient domestic payments can logically extend into the cross-border payments. Would you want to give us some perspective on the clearing that you do, the efficacy that it brings about in the payments ecosystem, and maybe logically extend it for the audience in terms of building the cross-border payments rail which can be as efficient?
Yeah, sure. So basically what we did in Colombia was to help the clearinghouse called ACH, Automated Clearinghouse, to move from the paradigm of sending files every 4 hours from Monday to Friday to the paradigm of sending transactions as they happen throughout the week, right? So that involved like helping them to think about like money on the internet as something that is like flowing as information is, and you don't have to describe that in a big file. You can send transactions as they happen. So the efficiency part comes from this basic change of, yeah, let's accumulate stuff and then send it every 4 hours to as soon as you have it, just send it over. Of course, that was not possible 50 years ago when these technologies were built. So we're not criticizing the file-based approach, but we're taking into account that we moved to a different world. We already have the internet. Communications are flowing in real time, and if money is information, it should flow as fast as any other message. WhatsApp is one of the sponsors of the conference, right? And any user of the application will be surprised if we have to batch the messages and they can be only sent every 4 hours, like it used to be with physical letters. So we're just helping them to move from this file-based approach that was the best thing that we could build 50 years ago to the real-time message-based communications that we can do today on the internet.
Thanks, Jorge. And I think one of the growing schools of thought today, and you spoke about standardization, right, is that standardization has to be essentially on two counts. One is about the technology, and second is about the user interfaces and the convenience. And that brings me to Deeksha. Deeksha, you represent Google. It's the most loved technology company. You are actually playing a very important role in India on the Google Pay. At a click of a button, you can transfer money. It's a very intuitive interface that we have, and congratulations. Building on the thoughts that the panelists have had, Deeksha, what are your thoughts in kind of believing that a standardized user interface within the domestic framework should remain constant and standard if you have to build, real-time cross-border rails and bring in some efficiency, not just tech stack, but also the user interfaces? Your thoughts around this, Deeksha?
Thanks, Anubhav. And, I'll start with two anecdotes, and these are over just the last 1 week. For those of us who are old enough to have children going over to colleges, this is college season when children are going abroad to study. And a friend's son called me a few days back saying that, my card is not working. And how do I open an account now? I'm very far away from home. I need to get documents to open an account, then get my card going, and I need to find a way to make some payments. We figured some things out, but it did take some amount of heavy lifting. And there was someone who called me just yesterday, and he was saying that, in India, it's so simple to make payments today. It's so intuitive. He just knows when he opens the app, any app, thanks to NPCI, most of them are standardized. You know what the icon looks like. You know where to press the button, how to do the QR. And it's so simple. He doesn't need to think about payments anymore. Payments at its heart is a friction. And the less the friction is, the better it is. So I think the contrast between what we experience oftentimes on the domestic side versus what it becomes when we go international, it's true for all of us, whether, we're trying to buy currency, trying to make our cards work overseas. And what has worked for us in India being an example of, how digital payments has happened in domestic markets, is that it's interoperable, it's standardized, and it gives predictability to the end user. And we do believe that, replicating this as we look at payment rails across the world would definitely help in terms of user adoption, which is a big one, because when we get these highways built, we also want adoption to come in. So yeah, Anubhav, I would say that building on some of those standards, which might require for us to have conversations across multiple bodies in the ecosystem. So the other learning from UPI was that it brought the ecosystem together. So whether it would be maybe central banks across or it would be payment participants across, getting those standards interoperable across markets is something that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Deeksha. And I think one of the important aspects that then comes about is the regulatory framework. And I think Shergeran made a brief reference to TCIB. Now, I'm not sure if the audience here are aware, the transactions cleared on immediate basis is actually a scheme which is operating within the SADC region. Barbara, you are a participant as a regulator in that scheme. It would be prudent and opportune, I believe, for you to give a brief on the regulatory perspectives on an existing real-time, low-value, low-cost, settlement within the SADC region. I think that's a good build for us to take it forward and extend it to the cross-border, across continents, maybe.
Yes, indeed. So when it comes to the TCIB, which is, as Anubhav has highlighted, transactions cleared on an immediate basis, this was as a result of a public policy objective that emanated back in 2016 from the SADC Council of Ministers, with the objective of looking after financial inclusion and access on a cross-border basis. So, of course, as central bank regulators, we were then tasked to look at what is it that can be done within the region as part of integrating the payment systems across the region. Now, that I've already spoken a little bit about the complexities around it, but we have come a long way, and where we are at today is, of course, from a regulator perspective, is around the harmonization, of course, standardization, which has been spoken about, as well as ensuring and see how can we put rules, standards, and arrangements in place that can manage risk, because after all, what we are looking at is, in as much as all of these good things need to happen for the customer to have that seamless experience, there is a lot of risk that you want to ensure you manage appropriately so that your financial system remains stable. So as a result of that, of course, BankservAfrica, they are our scheme manager, and they are tasked with, of course, putting all these rails in place and making sure that everything runs smoothly for the customer experience with the support of the central banks within the region. Now, where we are at today, I think we've passed the pilot stage, and we are now in a stage where we are onboarding, where a number of participants, both banks and non-banks in the region. It is going a little bit slower than we expected, but there is, of course, still a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that we can have that capability off the ground, especially from a participation point of view. But I think there are good lessons to be learned in terms of really when you get different stakeholders around the table, and getting those stakeholders to work in tandem within jurisdictions, because you also have, in as much as we talk Southern Africa as a regional bloc, there are different currencies also in place, different currencies, and different jurisdictions need to therefore see how do we transact with different currencies if you don't have a single currency. So those add certain complexities also. So we are working towards having that scheme as a multi-currency scheme to ensure that we can then provide with this real-time and cheaper low-cost capability for transactions to flow within our region.
Thank you, Barbara. And I think, would it then be safe to assume that there is an alignment in the sub-Sahara African region coming about in the inter-country real-time cross-border payments? And you briefly mentioned BankservAfrica is the scheme manager. Shergeran, would you want to briefly touch upon your experience on managing the scheme, while Barbara has given a perspective broadly on the regulatory framework? It'll be good to hear on how you're managing that clearing and the scheme on the SADC region for TCIB.
Thanks, Anubhav. So I think that Barbara had mentioned in her initial address that the SADC corridors are amongst the most expensive in the world. It's approximately 4.2% higher than the global average. So I'm absolutely in support of Barbara's point there, just so you're aware of the cost implications that are being experienced in the SADC corridors. When we were appointed as the regional clearinghouse system operator it actually dated back to 2013. And that was for a low-value payment system which actually never really got off the ground. It was an electronic funds transfer system. And then the industry and the regulators realized that they should actually try to move into more real time, and that's where TCIB came about in 2016, or the concept for TCIB came about in 2016. TCIB got launched in 2021. To Barbara's point, though, it was much slower than had been anticipated. We've currently got 2 live participants, one from Namibia and one from Zimbabwe. So that corridor has now been established. And there are 7 other corridors, countries that are in the process of being targeted and going live, which includes South Africa. Unfortunately, South Africa in itself has been a bit late to the party because of the fact that a number of the domestic banks would prefer the existing correspondent banking relationships. And so it's really been a process of trying to encourage them and demonstrate to them that the system has been built robustly, that there are adequate rules and controls in place to be able to allow them to migrate onto the system. We now have one bank in South Africa that is going to be going live, and we anticipate that that will actually allow the other banks to also then start following suit. To Barbara's point, there are a number of different factors that would have come into play in serving as friction. The regulatory harmonization was certainly one of the key elements there. There has been a program to develop a model law, and unfortunately, it's just not gone as fast as one would have liked. Something else that requires some element of regulatory coordination would be the fact that for each, you're looking at 16 different countries within the region. So each role player, each participant that wants to, or each entity that wants to participate would have to get the go-ahead from their own regulatory authority to be able to participate. So this requires them to be able to, whether it be banks and non-banks. So something else to be mindful of is that TCIB actually has got banks and non-banks participating in this, which for all intents and purposes, those non-banks would be your fintechs. Now, in a South African context, and so for a second, just suspend the TCIB consideration. I'm going to take us back to RPP, the real-time payments system pay shop that I spoke about initially. In the South African context, notwithstanding that the system had been designed with the banks, with the fintechs and so forth, however, when it comes to direct participation, given our existing regulatory framework, it is only banks that are able to participate directly in RPP. So any non-bank would have to actually then work with a bank to be able to do so. We are currently in the process of undergoing regulatory reforms, and as part of those regulatory reforms, it is anticipated that there will be non-bank direct participation as well. So as you can tell in the TCIB existence, it's actually a step ahead than we are domestically in South Africa, because they've actually got non-banks that are able to participate as well, albeit requiring the approval of the regulators for each of those countries. Just getting back to, I wanted to, and the reason I'm going to juxtapose between the RPP system and what we're trying to build there versus the TCIB is that in due course, there will be a convergence of those systems. So we are really trying to build an efficient system in South Africa. And one of the things that we're experiencing in South Africa is that there's still, notwithstanding that we have got a fairly advanced payment system, 9 out of 10 payments in South Africa are still made with cash. And one of the things that we're trying to do with RPP is to be able to displace at least 10% of that. And we anticipate that displacement would result in about 450 billion rands coming through the national payment system. And if that 450 billion rand comes through the national payment system, it could actually then be utilized and flow through the economy. We consider ourselves as a systemically important financial market infrastructure. We have got a public interest objective as well to support the regulator in achieving public interest. And seeing as we view ourselves as I certainly use this analogy, I can't say we, but I certainly do, as an integral valve that allows the lifeblood to flow through the vascular and arterial system. I always use this, it's quite a graphic description, but I always view payments as being the lifeblood of the economy. And if the payments are going to be able to flow seamlessly and efficiently through the lifeblood, through the economy, through the body, it will result in the health of the body, and it will improve the health of the body. So South Africa currently, as with the rest of the world, we are all experiencing issues, high inflation, our inflation currently at 7.8%. Economy is quite stagnant, and we believe that an efficient, robust payment system with real-time payments that allows money to flow through the system will actually result in an uptick in the economy as well. A lot of South Africans also have, particularly, even though there's been we've got approximately 70 to 80% in terms of bank accounts. However, most people in the country, particularly those that are recipients of grant payments, they only use that bank account as a postbox. They get money in once, they withdraw it all, and then they use the rest in cash. So we're trying to encourage them to be able to, once RPP goes live, and once PayShop, the brand, actually becomes ubiquitous in the market, we want to encourage and instill a sense of trust that people will start to use these digitized ways of paying, and to be able to then result in less cash in the system, potentially less crimes, and hopefully it will have a positive uptick. And we see this, so to your question was about efficiency, how an efficient payment system can also then flowing through from a regional cross-border. Similarly, those are the similar types of considerations from a TCRB consideration.
Impressive. And I don't know how many people here are aware, South Africa, I believe, has done away with the checks completely. So you're getting digitized in a big way. And you briefly spoke about, Shergeran, with regard to the banks and the non-banks participation. And therefore, before I go to Jorge, I'll quickly jump onto Deeksha and then Barbara. On your thoughts, Deeksha, on what are the possible enabling provisions that you see for the love techs, the big techs, the fintechs to evolve for a very seamless integration and participation in not just the domestic play, but also cross-border play. Once you have the thoughts, maybe I'll jump to Barbara on a regulatory perspective on how that can be enabled. Then I'll go to Jorge. Deeksha, please.
I was telling someone that oftentimes to build for the future, it's helpful to look back into history and see if there's some lessons to be learned. And when we look back at what's happened over the last 5 years, Google Pay just finished 5 years on September 18 in India. The story that is panned out in terms of digitization of payments in India, 3 things hold for us. The first one, it's interoperable. The fact that the trinity of Jan Dhan accounts, mobile, and what is happening in terms of all the banks participating, whether it was a particular bank, a particular mobile phone, or a particular type of account, irrespective of what each of those brought in, users were able to dip into digital payments on UPI. The second one was an ecosystem approach, i.e. Regulators, clearing bodies, banks, fintechs, other types of participants, all of us came together not only to play our own individual roles, but also in terms of finding a joint vision on how we want to run it. Something as simple as if a fraud was identified on one sort of platform, the pace at which it goes across in terms of the ecosystem for us to have lessons learned and to make our payments safer for our users is incredibly fast in the ecosystem today. And which brings me to the last one, which is a partnership approach. They say if you want to go further, go together. And in payments, in journey that we've been, it's held so true. So I think, Anubhav, to your point, therefore, some of these bits in terms of interoperability, common standards like we were discussing, in terms of having an ecosystem-wide approach, not only in the design, but in the ongoing running of processes. And lastly, a truly partnership platform-based approach is something we feel not only held good for digital payments, but will be equally helpful for international as well.
Barbara, your thoughts around this? I think Deeksha has brought about very effective points in terms of the partnerships, in terms of the open frameworks that we're looking at. How do you see the regulatory framework evolving to kind of accommodate these SaaS originating from the ecosystem?
Yes. So there's something that she said earlier that I really liked and resonated actually, which I want to latch on to say, anyone, whether you are a regulator or a user of payment services, the last thing that you need to think about is, how am I going to make this payment? Should I use card? Should I use EFT? Should I use UPI? Should I use what? That shouldn't even be on. All that you need to think about is how much I need to pay. So that is really how seamless things would be. Now, in order for that to happen, different players come up into this ecosystem and these platforms. So from a regulatory perspective, of course, we are also equally going through some transformations internally to look at not just our internal processes, but how do we need to think about regulation differently, given these different type of players that are now coming, especially onto the payments ecosystem. Many of these players are not your traditionally or your traditional players like your banks that are used to being regulated. Fintechs are not used to regulation. So how do we ensure that we understand each other? Because we have a risk mindset as regulators generally, that's what we do. But we need to equally be open to innovation, because how do we ensure that there's interoperability, that there's all these new seamless payments happening cross-border, cheaper and so on. The fintechs bring a certain level of agility to the payments ecosystem. So what we are looking at is, of course, you would have seen and heard of the sandboxes. A lot of the regulators across the globe are looking at introducing and have already introduced sandboxes, incubators, innovation hubs, you name it, to try and understand what is it that a fintech is bringing to the table. How do we understand the risks and the opportunities that are there? How do we develop our regulations then based on the understanding that we get through this? Because ultimately, what we are working towards is to ensure that there remains trust in your national payment system and in payment systems globally. Because if you send money, whether it is here from India to the US, to Namibia, to wherever, that sender need to have trust that that money is going to get there and be used for the intended purpose. It's not going to end up anywhere else. And that is what us as regulators are trying to establish, whether it is at a domestic front, a regional front, or globally. And therefore, those partnerships become so important and so critical. So from an enabling environment, those are the key things that we are looking at from setting the scene and to ensure that we can look at all of this. Now, we obviously also work with the principle of same business, same risk, same rules. That principle, but we try and advance that principle to also understand that, you know, in as much as we are looking at that principle, you still need to ensure that you fully understand what is it that this business is trying to achieve within this ecosystem, and therefore deal with it in accordance. It's not going to be an issue of, okay, because you are a fintech, you are going to be very lightly regulated necessarily. It is about the potential risk, the potential benefit, and whatnot that you can potentially introduce to the ecosystem, and accordingly we then set regulations and enable those type of players then also within this ecosystem to bring the necessary benefits that we require from a public policy objective point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I think you make a very important point. If I can summarize, you're saying we need to enable the technology, the big techs, the fintechs under effective regulatory framework. That's a very promising statement for future. And you spoke about the tech stack, the network perspective. I want to jump onto Jorge again. You're a young tech wizard, Jorge, and I think the audience would want to know there are some challenges which are obviously coming across in terms of seamless cross-border payments. And that has got so much to do with the different standards that the countries use within the domestic payments. Some are on ISO, some have a proprietary messaging standard. Now, when you're talking about an effective, low-cost, cross-border, real-time payment system, how do you, from a technology enablement perspective, see all of these stacking together and seamless integrations to provide for these kinds of rails, Jorge?
Sure. So I will get back on a few points before I address your
Absolutely,
question.
please.
Because what Barbara just said about regulation caught my attention in the sense that, I'm going to make an analogy if you allow me.
Please.
There's two ways to make cross-border payments. One is you make a transaction from one country that arrives at the other. But the other one is that you physically go to another country and then swipe your bank account from your original country, right? In both cases, money is crossing borders, and Minka's philosophy is that money must flow. So to your question, what is this fintech trying to do? In our case, is we're trying to break the barriers that is preventing money from flowing. Information must flow is one of the values that unites us through the internet. And of course, there are different jurisdictions and different positions on how much information must flow, so the same will apply regarding how much money must flow. But regardless of the technology that we built, I think the regulatory alignment must come from the value alignment, deciding how important it is for us to let information flow, to let money flow, and then define the cross-border payments in terms of that. So the analogy that I was going to make is the regulation is like when you need a visa to go to a country. So I just came from the UK, but I'm Colombian. I'm in the UK with a tourist visa, and I came to India on an electronic travel authorization visa, right? And I've decided to visit different countries depending on how easy it is to get a visa. In this case, it was very easy to get a visa for India. It used to be more difficult before, and even though I was living in China for 3 years, pretty close compared to Colombia, I never came before because it was more difficult than it is right now. So regulators could think about money flows in the same way. Like, what do we want to attract? What are the values that we believe in, right? And eventually determine different or better policies to make it easier for money to flow across borders, whether it's a payment coming from a different person to a local business, or that person getting an electronic visa and traveling directly to the country to spend it. Now, to your question about standards, I started commenting on money as information, and the technology we're building is a messaging platform, like WhatsApp for money or something like that. And at the end of the day, you can translate regulatory alignment and all this value alignment to a common language. So when you say protocol in technology, you're talking about a language for two different systems to talk to each other. So pretty much in the same way that we're using English to speak across cultures, we have to define those common languages at a regulatory level and then at a technical level to be able to express and send those messages that we're sending at a platform basic. So what are we trying to do when we send money? We're promising to pay. Most money these days is a promise to pay, an IOU, right? So that regulatory alignment needs to be translated to a common language to say this is what we want to allow, this is what we do not want to allow, these are the visas that we want to grant, these are the money flows that we want to grant, and eventually translate to a protocol at a technology level so that we can say, yes, these messages should flow through the border, and these other messages need more regulation or whatever.
No, thank you. I think you have broadened the spectrum in terms of the thoughts that we were looking at, and great analogy there. I think there are a couple of points which remain untouched, and in the interest of the time, I'll quickly jump on to Deeksha, and then maybe to Barbara. One of the points, Deeksha, that we spoke about, and it's a part of the discussion theme. how do you believe the most love tags, the large tags, can actually play an instrumental role in bringing down the costs of the payments in cross-border? That's one. And Barbara, then maybe you could give a brief advice on the compliance parts of it, right? We spoke about the detailed on the cross-border, but I think it's a regulatory requirement for the money flowing overseas. The enablement, if you could briefly touch upon the compliance checks, the KYC, ML requirements, I think then we would like to close with some of the thoughts. But Deeksha, over to you for how do we look at love text to bring down the costs?
I think if you look in terms of, just the way payments have evolved, we've had instances where when cash is paid, actually the merchant for the collection of their cash has anywhere cost of between 1 to 3%. Similarly, when you look at some of the other digital payments tools, the market has been paying MDRs, different MDRs in different countries, but if you were to take the example of India, anywhere about 1.5%, right? UPI in India is free. If it, even a few were to be charged, I think that would look to be very, very high. I guess if you were to translate that similarly, all of us, whether as users or as banks or as fintech players, we know that cross-border involves a lot of cost in terms of transferring money. We've had, those dollars chipped off when we've sent a wire or received a wire. And if we were to reimagine in terms of what would a cheaper, cross-border payments world look like, part of that solve will need to come through in terms of, what Jorge was speaking on, having a common set of languages, because right now, a lot of that cost comes from translating to one language used in the US to, let's say, used in Europe when, the money is flowing through, then coming into India. So multiple hops, multiple languages, cost of translation of language, and then, of course, in terms of how do you build security and trust, because you don't know each of those parties as easily as you do in a domestic world or if you're face-to-face. What can we do in terms of, technology players to play our role? As I said earlier, we truly believe in the power of partnerships and of platforms, of how the ecosystem can come together. So just as how we're working with NPCI right now, some of us would know that there is, a foray out to say how can UPI enable Indians traveling overseas. If they're going and they got a similar visa, and they've traveled, let's say, to a Singapore or to another country, and they wanted to pay through their same favorite UPI app at a merchant, how can we enable that? That's one step forward in terms of, how we enable that on our apps. And similarly, I'm sure, as these partnerships go along, it's food for thought for us to think in terms of how can we enable similar user experience across the board.
So, Barbara, a couple of minutes on the compliance checks, and in the interest of time, then maybe we'll close with one statement across 30 seconds each. Before that, maybe on the compliance side, I think that's important.
All right. So I'm sure everybody, when they look at regulators and they engage regulators, the first thing that comes to mind is the cost of compliance. We are very aware of the cost of compliance. It's one of those things that's a necessary evil, but we have to deal with it. But we as regulators, we are also looking at how can we assist in bringing down the cost of compliance. And in that regard, of course, SupTech and RegTech plays a very important role for us also to see how best that can happen. The other thing that is also very important is around the harmonization of these frameworks, how we do KYC, how we comply with AML, CFT regulations. Those need to be aligned so that what is done in Namibia shouldn't be very different from what is done in Zimbabwe or in South Africa and so on, because that in itself also increases the cost of compliance. So we are also equally looking at how best we need to harmonize some of those compliance aspects. But it is necessary for them to happen. KYC, e-KYC registries, those are things that we are looking at ensuring that these things happen so that even on a cross-border basis, information can be shared so that it makes easier the onboarding of clients to still make sure that those transactions, as they flow, whether they flow domestically or cross-border, that there is still, it's a trusted transaction, the message that goes along with that, as you're rightfully saying, it's a lot of message flows, so that what goes into that message, that it is actually information that can be trusted, it's correct information in order to ensure that there is no undue activities or illegal activities that are happening with regard to the flow of funds, even on a cross-border basis. So those are the kind of things that are important for us, especially when we start talking interoperability, cross-border interoperability of payment systems. And standardization. So those are all part and parcel of trying to work towards making sure that we can all tick those compliance boxes at the least cost-effective or at the most cost-effective manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And I think we have dwelled upon multiple aspects, broadly touching upon delivering the faster, cheaper, and secure real-time payments across the globe. The last couple of minutes, may I request, beginning from you, Shergeran, to leave one specific thought that audience can take away on this aspect, which can kind of invoke some, unique, intuitive thoughts around how this could, going into the future, become a reality, and then followed by Jorge and, Deeksha, and then Barbara. Shergeran.
Thanks, Anubhav. I'm not sure if this counts as a pearl of wisdom, but I would suggest that one would need to be clear about what it is that they're trying to address. So what is it? What is the problem statement or the use case that you're trying to resolve? And then be clear about it when you're engaging with your constituency and your constituencies and your stakeholders with whom you're going to be engaging to be able to address that. Because technology can solve everything. We know it's technology pretty much can do anything. It's really about the ecosystem beyond the technology, the individuals, the human beings. That's where the complexity really lies. And being able to get them across the line and being able to put across a compelling case for change.
Technology can solve everything. Jorge, I saw you smile. What are your thoughts? One thought that you want to leave on the table for you to take back home.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm a programmer, so I agree with that. But what I wanted to comment on is more on what I was saying before and what we exchanged on languages and regulation. So to summarize, on our side, money is information. Money is a form of language. And what we want to figure out, not just at a regulatory level, but a social level, what do we want to say? And what should we be allowed to say? If money is language, there's some sort of free speech attached to it. But it doesn't mean that we should be able to say anything. Because in the same way that there are fake news on the internet, there will be fake money. And we have to make sure that we're keeping our economies in a healthy state. So basically, at the end of the day, once we figure out that language, the whole point of having internet money is to improve human communication and to make all those translations so that we can talk to each other and say something like, hey, I like your product, I want to buy it. Or I like your business, I want to invest in it, regardless of whether I'm doing it at a national level or cross-border.
Money is language is a powerful thought. Thank you, Jorge. Deeksha, over to you.
Our world often starts with how the consumer thinks and ends with that. So I'll just give the consumer view on this. I wish that, the future of cross-border payments can be simple and secure. And so any user, when they think about cross-border payments, they don't think of complexity. They just think, oh, it was so simple.
Solving complexity. Thank you, Deeksha. Barbara.
She's almost taken the words out of my mouth, because I was thinking of human behavior still dictates at the end of the day. Technology, it's necessary, it makes things easier for us, but in the end, human behavior is the one that dictates what is it that needs to happen also. And therefore, with any human behavior, there are risks involved. So we need to also take that component in mind as we are doing things faster and more efficient. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And I think we're just about out of time. I do not know if that leaves time for us to have a couple of questions coming in. But on behalf of the audience here, thank you, Barbara, Deeksha, Jorge, and Shergeran for such an interesting and engaging discussion. I hope you have a great session going ahead in the day as well. Thank you, everyone.
Well, some real thought-provoking and also enabling ourselves towards simple solutions making and delivering faster, cheaper, and secure real-time payments across the globe. Give it up, guys, for the panelists here. And Mr. Anubhav for moderating this session so well.